Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, to everyone from the sunny Hague here in the Netherlands. I'm greeting you from the premises of Eurojust, where we are still teleworking for the time being, mostly, but that does not affect our effectiveness. And I'm happy to see so many of you in today's seminar or event, although Tim has instructed you to switch off your cameras for the reasons of technology. Now, I will try to share with you my presentation, and I will do it in 2 seconds. And I will speak to you about the importance of impact in the security justice chain. Now, these words at the beginning might be quite intimidating, and I have full sympathy for those of you who feel such feelings. If I speak to my colleagues, prosecutors, I myself am a prosecutor for a very long time, and ask them about impact, I would see a lot of question marks in their eyes. And that is quite often within judiciary in general, the prosecutors and judges are not often very familiar with the impact. One of the aims of today's seminar is to change that a little bit, because the whole system of impact, as we will see, does relate to judiciary and is affecting also our work, and we can exploit the opportunities which this project, which this cycle is offering us. And I will try in the next 20 minutes to give you a short, brief description of the opportunities and the types of support that we can benefit from this impact cycle. So, as I said, when we talk to judiciary and the people representing judiciary or working in a judiciary, they always ask, what is impact? What is this? When we hear about impact, the first impression and the first reaction, the first association is that this is something for the police. This is not really this is not really a judiciary issue. This is something that police deals with, and we don't really have to know much about it. If we dig a little bit deeper, then we start to understand that, well, perhaps there is some links, but we don't really understand how these links are established and what the links are, and how is this whole thing actually relevant for the prosecutors. These are the typical questions, and I hope by the end of my presentation today, at least some of the answers to those questions will be perhaps a little bit more clear. Now, in order to try to understand the links and the connections, we should start at the beginning. We should take a look at the bigger picture. We should look at the security justice chain in general. This is a scheme which is very familiar to all of you, regardless of which part of the world you're coming from, because as I heard today, we have participants from everywhere, from all very different countries across the globe, and the legal systems, I can only imagine, are also very different. But in principle, we are all dealing with a justice security chain, which is pretty much similar in all the countries. Things usually start with the police. The police is first informed about potential crime. The police starts initial investigation and then hands over the case to the prosecution if there is enough evidence for the continuation of the process, of the proceedings. The prosecution then further scrutinizes, analyzes the case, assesses whether or not the sufficient evidence is available and represented, and if yes, the prosecution brings the case to the court, to the judiciary, and the judiciary will deliver the justice, and it will issue a sentence in the form of acquittal or conviction, whichever be the case regarding the evidence. These things are known and are clear. And they are represented by the slide that you see now. The size of the slides, the blocks on the slides, the police, the prosecution, and judiciary is, of course, a little bit different, and this is not a coincidence. The size of the blocks does not represent the importance of each actors in the chain, because all those actors are actually equally important. They are all playing a crucial role. Without any of the actors in the chain, there would not be a chain, and there would not be results in the end of the chain in the form of justice being delivered. The size of the blocks, however, represent the amount of information and the amount of cases which are handled by each of those actors. By the nature of things, the things begin within the police, and the police has the largest quantity of cases and the largest amount of information available, and they have to deal with those vast quantities of information, intelligence and data, and also evidence, and try to form a case which they present to the prosecution, and prosecution would then analyze the case, and it would the prosecution will actually determine and decide whether or not the evidence is sufficient for the beginning of a judicial phase of the process. So the amount of information goes from larger to smaller, and it's filtered through the system. This is what is represented by the slides and by the size of the blocks that you can see on the screen. The amount of information is also posing certain requirements on those bodies, the police, the prosecution, and judiciary, in order to be able to process so many information and so diverse information. Some sort of prioritization and some sort of internal system for selection should be established. And this is where EMPACT comes in as a part of those systems. It is, of course, not the only system, but it is one of the systems. And what is important for the system is that it is EU-based. It is run at the level of European Union, so it affects all member states of the European Union to a certain extent. If we take a closer look what the EMPACT actually is, I will try to make this as brief as possible, as simple as possible, because as I said, it is a little bit, it is mostly law enforcement driven, and for judiciary it's sometimes a little bit difficult to understand. And if you add another layer of complexity, which is the fact that this is EU project, it means that it is technically quite complex. So I will try to give you a brief outline in order to give you the picture of what it is all about, and what is the main idea behind it, and what is the main principle that drives the whole cycle. Now, the name EMPACT is abbreviation for European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats. Now, if you read the name carefully and slowly and try to make sense out of those complicated words, you will already get a certain idea of what it is. It's actually a platform to assess threats and manage threats and act against them. So
a participant has joined the meeting.
Preventive mechanism, which of course is running within law enforcement, namely the police most of the time. Now, it is based as a European Union's cycle. It's a policy cycle which takes place 4 years to revolute 1 times. And it's an operational mechanism for tackling organized international crime. Now, in order to do that, the EMPACT has to identify and prioritize and address serious criminal threats. And this is done on extensive contributions and recommendations from member states, from relevant EU institutions and agencies, also third countries, and also organizations and academics and the private sector. So it is multidisciplinary. The input into this, the whole cycle, the input of information on which the analysis and assessment is made, is coming from multiple sources. Therefore, the EMPACT is aimed at bridging the gap between the European and the national crime strategies, and also between political decision-making and operational actions. As I said at the beginning, the EMPACT is EU-driven cycle. And there's a reason for it, because every country is facing criminal threats of a different kind. Some are very country-specific, some are international, some are cross-cutting, and for those threats to be addressed properly, a different kind of reactions need to be taken. And there are different priorities between member states, within member states. And in order to harmonize that a little bit better and coordinate them, harmonize is actually not a correct word for it, but to coordinate those prioritization processes within member states, this is one of the aims of the EMPACT, to kind of identify the most important threats, which are the same and which are existing in all member states, and to devise the ways and means on how to tackle those threats in all the member states. So to give us a coordinated response and thus breaching the differences in national politics, in national policies and national priorities. The key features of the impact cycle could be identified and could be defined in 3 points. It is intelligence-led. So it is not something academic, it is not a theoretical dispute, it's very practical. It is fed the real data, the real operational information, which is base for analysis. It is also cross-institutional. It is not only one police force in one member state. It is input from all member states. It is input from different EU agencies. It is fed with input from even non-governmental bodies and entities. So it provides a cross-institutional input. And it's also multidisciplinary. It's not only police, it's also customs, it's also other agencies. So all that is fed into the system in order to obtain the best information and to be able for the cycle to actually identify the best priorities and define the ways in which the best ways to address those priorities and threats. Now, what are the key benefits of impact? Well, first, it improves cooperation between national law enforcement and judicial authorities and customs offices and EU bodies and agencies and the private sector. So improved cooperation is one of the keys. And we have, you could see it very much, the result between of improved cooperation between the police forces and the police activities within the member states. And now we're trying to move this a little bit higher to see a little bit more improved cooperation also within judiciary. And this is one of the aims of today's event, to shed some light on the importance of the impact and the effects it has on the judiciary in general and prosecution in particular. Now, the second benefit is that the shared expertise and intelligence is obtained through a coming together of actors from diverse disciplines. Yes, because this is multidisciplinary because it entails many participants, many actors which contribute their input. Of course, the shared expertise and intelligence can enable us to better detect and define our goals, and of course, enable us to coordinately respond to common threats. These are the key benefits. Now, how does this system work? That's another question. These are the goals, these are the objectives, but in order to achieve them, the system has to be set in place, which will enable that. And this is what I will try to explain in this slide. In order to understand what impact is, we need to understand that it's actually, as I said, the cycle, and that it's based on serious and organized crime threat assessment, which we call SOCTA, and it's published every 4 years by Europol. This SOCTA actually contains a list of priority crime types in European Union. So these are the European Union, let's say, crime type priorities. This is the basis, this is the starting point on which the policy advisory document is being created by the presidency in the council, and it's based on the SOCTA. And on that, the EU crime priorities and operational action plans are identified by the Council. Now, I fully understand that this is a lot of very technical terminology, and please don't be bothered too much with it if you are not from the EU member states, or if you are not participating in the whole impact cycle. But this just gives you an overview on how the system is working, because on those EU crime priorities, then the multi-annual strategic plan is being set up, and then those plans are being developed annually, and each contains a number of operational actions which are designed with the aim to achieve certain goals. Now, this all looks pretty complicated, and it is. It's not always easy to understand, so perhaps it's better to have a look at the picture, which will a little bit simplify things. If you look at the circle on your left-hand side, you will get the overview how the whole system is actually working. It begins with the EU SOCTA, which you see in the circle a little bit to the right-hand top side. As I said, this is a serious and organized crime threat assessment. So this is an assessment of threat based on that, the strategic plan is being devised, and strategic plan is then further operationalized with operational actions which are taking place. And then when those actions are taken, they are being evaluated. Their effect is being evaluated, and also the whole general thing of threat is being analyzed and evaluated, and the new SOCTA is then issued after 4 years, and the new cycle begins. So it's a perpetual cycle which aims at the goal that we have always up-to-date prioritization within the EU countries, and we have always up-to-date plans and actions with which we want to cope and counter the threats that this crime is presenting. Okay, so much for the impact. Now, if there is one takeaway from the whole impact exercise, or the whole logistics of the impact, the takeaway would be the crime priorities. Perhaps this is the most important thing for us, prosecutors or members of the judiciary. And those crime priorities are they have been just set for the period of 2022 to 2025 in May this year, and they're fresh. And you can see the list of type of crimes which are now crime priorities: high-risk criminal networks, cyber attacks, trafficking in human beings, child sexual exploitation, migrant smuggling, drug trafficking, fraud, and so on, not to count everything and waste your time. You can see it here, and you can see that all those crime types basically are international crime. They are cross-border crime, and they are considered crime priorities at the EU level. And if you take a look at your own domestic priorities, I am pretty sure that many of them would also represent a priority in your own domestic legal systems. And this is where we come back to the security justice chain, which we have mentioned at the beginning. With the police at the beginning, with the largest amount of information and cases, then filtering through the prosecution to judiciary in order to obtain and to achieve justice in criminal case. Now, how does this whole impact process, with its evaluation, with its action plans, with its priorities, correlate and relate and impacts the justice chain? Well, these impacts can be defined, and those effects can be defined at two levels. The first level is a level of leadership. The leadership within the prosecution service is often, in many member states of the EU, tasked with prioritization of prosecutorial work. This is different in different countries, and the level of prioritization is different, and the type of prioritization is different in different countries, because we have different legal systems. Some countries, they have a prosecution policy, such as Slovenia. The other countries don't have it. They have a pure legalistic principle. They have to prosecute everything. But still, within that prosecution of everything, there is a certain quantity and quality of attention and the resources which are allocated to certain types of crime. So this type of prioritization is done within the prosecution service. And what is important is to know that, of course, this prioritization is affecting the police. And we could have a problem if our priorities of a prosecution service are different than the priorities which are defined for the police at EU level within the impact, because impact does that. It prioritizes the police work at EU level. It's a sort of guidelines to national police forces what should be the priority and how to tackle them. So for the prosecution service, it's important to understand that such prioritization exists within the police, and then if we understand how this is being created in the police, we can take this into consideration, or we can tackle this situation accordingly. If we do not understand it, then we have a problem, because there is difference in priorities between the prosecution and the police, and we don't know what is the reason for it, and we don't know how to handle it, and there could be a conflict and disharmony between the two organizations, and that is, of course, negatively impacting our efficiency as a justice system. So this is first of the effects of the impact on the national level. The second one is a little bit more down to earth, so to say, and hands-on. It relates to practitioners, to practical work in practical cases which are conducted and investigated by the police and the prosecution. More about that will be explained by my colleagues later on in the presentation on EncroChat and the particular case. at this moment, let me just say that there are certain forms of financial and logistical support for the crimes, which are considered to be impact crime, and they are provided at police level. So police force, if they are investigating a crime which is within the impact, defined as a impact crime, they have availability of certain additional financial and logistical support in the way of perhaps a specific analysis of data, or they have ability to meet in the meetings with other law enforcement people from other countries, and those meetings will be financed by the impact, and so on and so forth. So there are options for the prosecution there are options for the police to utilize the support in such cases. And for the prosecutor, this is important to know, because if we are dealing with a case which is important for us and which is international and which is in principle difficult to investigate, we want to utilize all the support that is available. And if the police has certain support available and the prosecutor is aware of that, of those options, he can then direct the work of the police accordingly to the support. So this is the effect at the national level. With this, I'm actually coming to the end of this presentation, and I will try to do it in the given time. So if we sum up, what is the importance of the impact for justice? It is indeed pretty much police-oriented, but it is also focused on a serious crime. So it affects work of the prosecution and, of course, justice in general. It is a sort of prioritization of police work. It is also a support to the police work in serious crime. And it's impacting security justice chain at two levels, the leadership level and the practitioners level. This is in a nutshell what impact is all about and how it relates to the prosecution. If I want to summarize the whole presentation in one sentence, it would be like this. It would be prosecute with impact to achieve the effect. This would be all from my side at this moment. I'm, of course, available for questions now or later during the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.